The jig head minnow took the world took the entire fishing industry last year, and it's definitely probably the #1 bait to use on Livescope. But there's a lot of baits. I've caught fish on everything from a topwater to a crankbait to a spinner bait, a chatterbait. I've caught fish on everything using it, but there's definitely, in my opinion, there's 3 main baits that are the probably most prominent Livescope baits, and jig head minnow being one of them. But there's just 3 baits that I'm gonna always have tied on if that's my strategy going into the day, if that's what I'm targeting fish using Livescope. And I wanna kind of run down my 3 main baits, the colors, the kind of setups I use on these baits that I've used a ton during this off season and probably will use a ton during this tournament season. So #1, we're gonna be short on this because everybody's heard about it. You know, it's the jig head minnow. So that's 100% probably the best Livescope bait, and reason being, because you can fish it at any depth. If you see fish 25, 30 foot deep, you can use it. If you see fish 6 foot deep, you can use it. So it's the #1 bait by far as far as targeting fish, you know, that you see on your electronics. And when it comes to your jig head minnow, I use the Zoom wing fluke mostly. You know, I worked with them a while on developing it and got a good bait for it. And it's just a fluke style bait. We have a 4-inch and a 5-inch and hopefully some other sizes coming eventually. But a 4-inch is probably the go-to. That's just the bait that, you know, all around the country, spotted bass, largemouth, smallmouth, they bite it. That's a good profile of, you know, a shad imitator, a little herring imitator. But the 4-inch wing fluke, I throw predominantly, and I'll, you know, alternate my sizes as I go. And I use a lot of different heads, from 1/16 all the way up to a 1/2 ounce. But I would say a 1/4 or a 3/16 are probably the 2 main sizes I use most of the time. I'm using the Greenfish Tackle Bad Little Shad head, and it's just a 1/4 ounce shad imitating head. And this is probably what I'll have tied on all year for when I see those situations. I think this year it won't be quite a jig head minnow dominated season because a lot of those fish are not gonna be offshore on bait like they were this previous year. But 1/4 ounce, 4-inch bait, 3/16 or 4-inch bait, that's kind of where I start my search, and then I might go heavier, I might go to a bigger bait as I feel like I know what the fish are doing better. When it comes to this, I throw it on my Hartwell Magic spinning rod. I like the shorter rod a little bit. I used to throw it on the 7.3, and I actually feel like my hookup percentage, my action working the bait is a little bit better with this shorter rod. It's a 6-foot 10-inch, and it's just a good rod far. I use it for wacky worm, a drop shot, a Nico rig. Use it for a lot of different things, but it's really good for this jig head minnow. With 8 to 10 pound braid is my go-to Cortland braid, and is what I'm using this year. And it real good braid, and 10-pound test is probably my all-around, but sometimes I like 8 because it casts a little bit farther. And your leader weight, you can vary depending on where you are. I generally start around 10-pound test. Sometimes I go lighter, sometimes I go heavier. But that's probably the #1 sonar bait. I know everybody's heard about it. It dominated last year, but you better get better at using it if you're gonna fish tournaments. So that's #1. The other spinning rod bait that I use a lot, and I actually had this fall, especially had a lot of success with this bait, especially catching spotted bass, was a Nico rig. You know, a Nico rig's really good. A lot of times those fish actually are more susceptible to biting when you lead them to the bottom, even if they're suspended or whatever. A lot of times they'll follow that minnow, they'll follow it, and they're just hard to get to eat it. But this Nico rig, a lot of times you can get the fish to see it, let them fall down to the bottom, or throw it on shallow rock, or anything that you see fish on. A lot of times this worm works better. So when it comes to a Nico rig, for all you who aren't familiar with a Nico rig, that's just kind of the name term for it. It's essentially a weighted wacky rig. So I like the Zoom Fluke Stick Junior. I'll use the bigger one sometime, but generally this is finesse application using Livescope. I like the smaller bait, so I use this smaller Fluke Stick Junior. Green pumpkin's always my go-to. Y'all watch me do hundreds and hundreds of videos on green pumpkin because I just haven't ever really felt the need to switch. Tilapia, green pumpkin, or tilapia or green pumpkin is about all I use. But Fluke Stick, and I know you've watched a bunch of my wacky worm videos, and I always say I don't like to use the O-ring, and normally I don't, but when it comes to a Nico rig, I have a tungsten nail weight in it, and I do use an O-ring because I hate when a fish comes up and jumps and slings my worm off and I lose my nail weight. So I use the O-ring always for a Nico rig because I'm putting that tungsten nail weight in it. But one thing you want to be very careful of, when you put this O-ring on this bait, and I take my nail weight, my tungsten nail weight, I use an arc nail weight. They're really small, really heavy because they're tungsten, and they're very sharp. They're easy to put in there. So I always put it in the fat end of this Zoom Fluke Stick Junior. So I stick it in there, and sometimes if I really don't want to lose my weights, I'll glue it in, but these actually stay in pretty well compared to others I use because they got pretty big ridges on them. But so you put that in, and this is where you want to be very careful. Once you get this in, always put your hook. I hook it under the O-ring, but I get a little bit of plastic too, and I put it where the bite of the hook points towards the tail, because you put that weight in and it's going to fall head first. So if your hook is hooked opposite with your hook tip towards the weight, then when those fish eat it, your hook is not pointed towards the roof of their mouth. It's pointed towards the bottom, and you might hook them in the tongue and kill them, or you might just miss them because your hook is not pointed the right way. So always hook it where the tip of the hook is pointed towards the tail of the bait. And I hook it in the rubber, but with the O-ring above it, and that just keeps you from losing quite as many. It's a Green Pumpkin Zoom Fluke Stick Junior. So same braid spinning setup. I also use the Hartwell Magic. It's designed for a wacky worm, which is what this is. And I use the Hartwell Magic on it, a gravity spinning reel, 2500 is what I use mostly, and the same braid, 8 to 10 pound test, 8 cast a little bit farther, but obviously you got a little bit heavier line with 10, and the same 10 pound fluorocarbon leader on this line. So that's a simple setup that I know catches a lot of fish, but I think a lot of times people are so hung up on the minnow that they see fish and try to get them to come up and eat something when they're much easier to catch actually getting to go to the bottom and eat it. So don't forget your Nico rig if you're seeing those fish on Livescope. And the last bait that I always have tied on, and I've actually been playing with this a ton this year, I'll do a video later on about, I've got scales on my hooks here, is a jerkbait. Caught a bunch of fish yesterday on a jerkbait and still got scales on the hook. But, so this, a jerkbait is it was basically the original front sonar bait. You know, before the jig had minnow craze, everybody threw a jerkbait. And I don't know why it's not as prominent as it used to be. You know, this was the main bait for throwing at suspended fish before front sonar and then after front sonar came out. And it kind of, I'm not gonna say it went away, but now people tend to throw the minnow more. But I've actually got to where I like the jerkbait better for certain situations. So the jerkbait, a lot of times if I'm having fish, if they're sitting high enough to see that jerkbait, you want to throw the minnow at them, and a lot of times that's great. They bite the minnow. But if they don't eat that minnow, then if you can't trick them into eating it when it works by them or whatever, you're kind of just, I mean, you're out of luck. They're going to follow it to the boat. They're not going to eat it. I know anybody that's used Livescope has watched a big fish follow that minnow all the way to the boat and not eat it. Well, the jerkbait is cool because if I can get them to see it, if they're not too deep, they'll actually come up and look at that jerkbait just like they do the minnow, but if they don't eat it immediately, you still have a chance. That's why I like the jerkbait. You can change your cadence, you can do whatever, you can let it sit, you can, twitch it real fast. You can do a lot of different things to trick fish into eating it versus the minnow, you just can't. I mean, if they don't eat it, a lot of times it's just, you can speed it up. You can do a lot of different things. I know there's tons of videos out there on minnow technique, and they're probably better at fishing minnow than I am, but I like the jerkbait because I can do things to make that fish eat it. And when it comes to jerkbait fishing, generally when I'm throwing a jerkbait, suspended fish, open water, I'm gonna go 12 pound test. 12 pound fluorocarbon is my go-to on my Century rod, designed for a jerkbait with the gravity casting reel. And it, you don't want to use too heavy line. Generally, I've done a lot of videos on using heavier line, but generally I want this jerkbait to get down a little bit so those fish can see it. And it's actually really surprised me how far they'll see it. On a lot of clear lakes, jerkbait gets down. This is an ARC 110 SP. This is the jerkbait I've been using, and I really, really like it. Casts great, and gets down to, this is just a regular diving jerkbait. I'd say 4 to 6 feet when you're watching it, but I've had fish come up from as deep as 20 feet when they saw it. So it's a good bait to get them to come up and look at, and you still got a chance to catch them. But the lighter line gets it down just a little bit deeper if you need it to. Just 12 pound test is my go-to. So these are the baits. I know you hear a lot about these baits probably in the news, but that's the 3 that after all my, Livescope school, I basically say I've fished every day for quite a while, getting better at it. Those are the baits that I found the most success on. Caught a lot of fish on different things. I know everybody says, Livescope's made a lot of baits obsolete, and I don't believe that's the case. I think that's just it's just the baits we tend to throw. Any fish that would bite anything before, they'll still bite that bait. But those are the 3 that I feel like I have the most success at catching those fish suspended. But don't limit it to those, but definitely always have those in your arsenal for any type of suspended fish, live scope fishing. No matter what you may be doing, those baits will be tied on my deck all year long. So hope you have some success out there and give those a try.